Namaskar. Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India at Jan Michalski Foundation, Betak. The festival brochure and flyer with the details of the full program are available for purchase at the information desk. We are delighted to introduce Kipling in India, India in Kipling. This session is presented by Business Standard. Rudyard Kipling was born in India and raised there for 5 years. He later returned, following schooling in England, to work as a journalist in Lahore and Allahabad. His writings and connection with India, its people, culture, languages, and locals stimulated imaginations of the distant Indian Empire in the minds of the British public. In a new volume of essays born at a conference at the Vice-Regal Lodge in Shimla, contributors from across the world explored the social and the thematic range of Kipling's Indian writings as represented in books like Kim and the Jungle Book. The contemporary interpretations of his work and his own experiences in India as a journalist, lover, writer, and most pertinently, an emblem of the Raj, are explored in the conversation with British poet Ruth Padel. Harish Trivedi, co-editor of Kipling in India, India and Kipling, as they discuss the riveting anthology on the Empire Laureate and his Indian writings. Can we have a warm applause for our speakers?
Well, good afternoon, and it's lovely to see you in this nice, cool venue. And I am immensely honored to be in conversation with Harish Trivedi on this extraordinary book. It seems to me, as a reader of Kipling, that it's a book that we've been waiting for all our lives. It is about his background and in India, his parents' background in India, and his own experience of India at different moments, and the struggle in his divided self that takes place in all the things that we write. And I just thought I'd start off by reading a little bit of the epigraph to Kim. This is verse from Kipling himself. Something I owe to the soil that grew, more to the life that fed, but most to Allah, who gave me 2 separate sides to my head. I would go without shirts or shoes, friends, tobacco or bread, sooner than for an instant lose either side of my head. So, first of all, Harish, welcome. And it's an amazing book. Even the index is a work of art and scholarship and love, I could see. Not many indexes have, for instance, ambivalence written in. How did you go about putting this together?
Yes. The story behind that is that I've had the opportunity and privilege of attending many conferences focused on Kipling, held in the West, in Britain mostly. And at each one of those conferences, people who are totally passionately devoted to Kipling, who are members of the Kipling Society, who read the Kipling Journal most attentively every 3 months, some of them would come to me in the evenings and say, do you have many conferences on Kipling in India to which we could possibly come? And it broke my heart to tell them that we have no Kipling conferences in India, that Kipling had so much to do with India. But these days, even in the university syllabi, he's not much read. And but then I decided, why don't we hold a conference on Kipling in India? He had a very strong connection with India. He was born in India. He grew up here till the age of 5 when he was sent home to go to school. He came back at the age of 17 to work for 7 years in India. He wrote about India continuously. So we thought of holding a conference here. And the place we chose, I have some influential friends, the place we chose was the Vice-Regal Lodge in Shimla, which was the heart of the empire when the British ruled here for 6 months of the year. And Shimla figures very largely and eminently in Kipling's writings. He visited there every summer that he was here in Lahore. So the Vice-Regal Lodge, which opened in 1888, Kipling was there, his parents were there. That is now the Indian Institute of Advanced Study. It's been put to very good use, almost better use than in those times. So we decided to go there for the conference. We had a closed conference in the sense that only the participants and some fellows at the institute. In the book, there are 18 chapters, and partly by design, by pushing it towards that, we have 9 contributions from Indians and 9 contributions from an international cast from Britain and Canada and Japan and the USA. So that's how the book came about. It took some time to edit, and I'm delighted. I've never come across the index of a book being praised up front. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I was an academic once too. I mean, the chapters that I found absolutely fascinating are particularly by the Indian authors. There's a psychoanalytic one about childhood, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about, he uses a child protagonist, both in the Jungle Book and in Kim, and there's this sense of a child who is abandoned, lost something, trying to look for something. Is this one of the things that attracts you in your work on him, your own?
Yeah. Kipling's childhood in India, from being born on the 30th of December, 1865, after what the mother told us was a 5-day labor, had it been one more, she said that even God did not take longer over creation. She was an extremely witty woman, Kipling's mother. So he was born here, and then they lived in Bombay. His father, Lockwood Kipling, on whom there is the chapter here, the connection between the father and the son. Lockwood Kipling came out to India to make India his career. He was a sculptor from the potteries. And he worked in London for a while. He wanted to marry. He'd found someone to marry. And he was advised that on the salary that he might earn in England, he could not afford a wife. So he came out to India. Now, the childhood that Kipling himself enjoyed in Bombay is not given to many English children to enjoy. Angus Wilson calls that early chapter in his book on Kipling, he calls it Paradise Lost. At the age of 5, he had to be sent home. Another biographer has called it his Indian kingdom. Though they were not very rich, Kipling's parents, they had 8 servants. And 2 or 3 of them, 3 or 4 of them perhaps, were looking after the young Kipling all the time. So that was his childhood, and it always stayed with him. There was an element of fantasy that it acquired when he was sent back to England. All English children who were born here, who were brought here when they were infants, were sent back at the age of 5, or at the most 6. Why were they sent home? Why were they separated from their parents? So that they may not turn native. This was the biggest fear, that if they continued beyond that age, then they would begin to think like Indians, mix with Indians, have Indian friends, and that would be horrible. So they were all sent back. Kipling has some short stories describing this, of people being sent back, and what a wrench it is for child and parent. But it had to be done. The white man's burden, white woman's burden as well. So he was sent back, but when he came back, and towards the end of his span of Indian writings, as you just said, in Kim, Jungle Books, of course, fantasy, reworking of that childhood. He was sent back so that he could not turn native. In his writings, he turned native with a vengeance. In the figure of Mowgli, and also in Kim. The hero Kim in that novel is an orphan He's been orphaned in India, British parents, Irish father, English mother, and he actually does turn native. So he fulfilled that fantasy of his here. Very happy childhood, very unhappy middle period in England. School was happy, but before that, they lived for 3 or 4 years, what he called the house of desolation.
So one of the beautiful and very profound essays talked about different readings of the Jungle Book. And of course, to the readings, you can add the Disney films, which actually I have never been able to watch. And she suggests that there are so many different readings of the Jungle Book, and one is as a kind of theatre. You get the happy things, and the animals are all jolly, and they're all singing songs. And that, in a way, is the colonizer's fantasy of the Jungle Book, or perception of the Jungle Book. But then there's a profound sort of childhood ghastly story about this desolation, that Mowgli has lost his mother, his Indian mother, and then he loses the wolves, and then finally he loses the jungle because he must go back because he's a man. And he says to Bagheera, am I dying, Bagheera? And Bagheera, I have it all in my head because I was one of the kids who read the Jungle Book. Let them fall, little brother, they are only tears, but thou must go back to man at last. And that's, I hated that. I wanted to stay with the animals. But I was so interested in the Indian readings. I mean, Salman Rushdie in Midnight's Children, he creates this metaphor of a broken mirror to explain the attempt of the Indian writer to recreate Indias of the mind. And then he says, the early Kipling is a writer with a storm inside him, and he creates a mirror storm of contradictory responses in the reader, especially if the reader is Indian. I have never been able to read Kipling calmly. Anger and delight are incompatible emotions, but the stories indeed have the power simultaneously to infuriate and entrance. Did that come out in the conference, the infuriate and entrance?
Well, before I do that, let me do something that, before I talk about that we should have done in the beginning. This is the book. It has a nice cover. So please do judge the book by its cover.
Absolutely.
It's available in the bookshop, I'm told. The publishers, another thing that I'd say is, yes, it is a book about Kipling in India. Thank you.
You're going to read a little bit from it.
Sorry?
Are you going to read a bit from it? Might you read?
Yeah.
You read.
Well, this year. Yeah. So
Divided self.
the passage that I was going to read is about, well, I might as well read it in a moment, about the question that you were asking about the Jungle Book and Salman Rushdie. One of the most insightful things that I've read about Salman Rushdie, who is not my topmost favorite author in the world, is that Rushdie is a new edition of Kipling.
A mirror version.
Mirror. But he's gone through the door and can't come back. He prefers to stay on there in the West. Yeah. They tried to encompass India according to their own slightly fantastical version. But what is important is, I don't think there was another British writer ever in the history of the British connection with India who knew India so well, who had lived here so long. There were others who had lived here quite as long. There is a minor writer called Edward Thompson, whose main claim to fame now is that he is the father of E.P. Thompson. But he lived in India for a long, he wrote 8 novels about India, but he is forgotten. Anyhow, Kipling invented India in English literature. Nothing like India in its fullness existed before in any representation of India in English literature, and Kipling did that. And of course, Kipling was a racist, Kipling was an imperialist. Ever since his own lifetime, Kipling has been cancelled. As we say now, he's been under constant cancellation. At the same time, he's been extremely popular. And of the British people who wrote about India, I think he had the most intimate knowledge of India. About this question, yes, his fantasy about free childhood, having one's own way, in the case of Mowgli, in the case of Kim, and then losing it, then waking up to adult reality. This happens in both these works. What happens to Mowgli after all his wonderfully merged existence with the animals in the jungle? Ultimately, he's claimed back by civilization, and he is employed by the British government as a forest ranger. Similarly, what happens to Kim after all that happens throughout the book? His escapade, the idyllic adventures with Lama. He again joins what is one version of the British Secret Service, the Great Game. So this is a bit like Falstaff and Hal. One can have one's fun for some time in early youth, in childhood, but then one has to get back to duty.
So one of the essays brought out that he is constantly negotiating some sort of critique of power, whether it's in the jungle or whether it's in the short tales, and it's particularly a critique, of course, of the colonial power. Would you like to talk about that a little?
If we talk about the British in India in any kind of version, whether historical or fictional, power is not very far away. The whole connection is based on power. There's a streak, there is the margin of people who came out here to study India or came out here to rule as members of the Indian civil service, but developed a scholarly fascination with India. So there is that margin. Not everybody is a complete Pakka Sahib. They have other dimensions to them. They're very learned. Many of them are well-meaning. Many of them are very sympathetic to Indians. But none of this would exist without power. And therefore, in Kipling too, the law of the jungle, for example, the jungle has its own law, which cannot be violated. So there's an interplay of play and duty, of seeming disorder and merriment and order.
And Mowgli is able to move through the jungle because he is given the master words.
Yeah, indeed. So, Kipling has been psychoanalyzed several times before. What are the different impulses that guide him, that conflict within his own mind and coexist? Another thing that happens with Kipling is my own sense of what Kipling felt about India. He wrote about 40, 45 short stories about India. Of his 4 novels, 2 are set in India. Not only Kim, but also Naulakha, the necklace that cost 9 lakhs of rupees, Naulakha, except that Kipling got the spelling wrong in the title of the novel. I mean, there's so much Kipling knew and so much that he did not. And because he co-wrote it with an American whose sister he went on to marry after that man died, out of sentiment for that, even when it was pointed out to him that Naulakha was spelled wrong, he kept that misspelled title in memory of his departed friend. And when he decided to go and live in America with his American wife, he built a house there in Vermont, which he again called Naulakha. This time, fortunately, spelled right. So the play in Kipling, I think Kipling's overall perception of India was of complete fascination, childlike fascination, which is described beautifully in Kim. The Grand Trunk Road being the river of life, so much color, so much movement, almost exotic, but also lit up by a deeper understanding of what the Indians were about. That is one part. The other part is India was terrible and India was horrible. And by terrible and horrible, I mean to evoke the etymological meaning of these words, that India induced terror in the hearts of the British. Because they knew that they would not understand it. They knew that they understood very little of it, and there was so much else beyond. Horrible because it also invoked horror in their minds, the fear, and fearful, same thing. So there were all these very mixed feelings which come across in Kipling's writings, here and there. And at the same time, as I said, let me read out that passage that I meant to read out about Kipling's connection with India, which partly I wrote and partly I quoted in the introduction that we write to this book. What I wrote was, altogether, India gave him a rampantly carefree childhood, pointed him to and confirmed him in the vocation of a writer, and gave him a subject matter which would prove to be his true quarry and last him for the most fertile part of his writing career. And then I quote a couple of sentences from Charles Allen, who has a book called Kipling Sahib, about Kipling's life in India and writings. He writes, India was where Rudyard Kipling was happiest, where he learned his craft, where he rediscovered himself through his writing and came of age as a writer. India made him, charged his imagination. And after he left India in March 1889 at the age of 23, he was most completely himself as an artist when re-inhabiting the two Indian worlds he had left behind. He was in a state of higher creativity, which he was unable to maintain later on once he had exhausted his Indian memories with the writing of his masterwork, Kim. Now the chronology is, Kim comes out in 1901. Kipling is 35. He has another 35 years to live, 30, more than that. He died in 1936. But that's the midpoint. And he doesn't write about India after that midpoint, after 1901, hardly. Now, this first phase of Kipling's life is Indian. And the way I understand it, he's an imperialist, he's a jingoist, but not in the same way when he lives here and when he writes about India. He becomes hardened by 2 or 3 factors that happen after he has done with India. One is the Boer War.
And his son died. Didn't his son die in the World War?
Yeah. All this happens later. He goes to South Africa. He comes to know Rhodes. And then he becomes much more of the imperialist that we know. The Indian side is softer and more ambivalent.
Well, I was thinking, I mean, there's a lot in the book about the fluidity of himself and the 2 sides of his head and so on. And I was thinking, maybe only somebody who is so hybrid, who had lived in both worlds and felt allegiance to both worlds, could be the sort of writer who so appeals to people in the unconscious way. And I mean, the deep unconscious layer. And there's a chapter in here about, a wonderful chapter about Ka and Kali, Ka the python, and the cold layers. And I just recommend you all to read that chapter, particularly if you come from Kolkata. But I was realizing that the snake is the creature of the earth, and it's that lowest layer which appeals to all of us, which he could somehow utilize, anyway, up to the age of 35.
Yeah, that's a wonderful chapter. And you can perhaps guess that the connection between Ka, the serpent, and Kali, the goddess, is made by a contributor in this book who's a Bengali. This is only natural and predictable. These are our internal kind of acknowledgements. Yes, indeed. And, with Kipling, one gets a feeling that one does not get with the other major writer about India in English, E.M. Forster, that, as you said, in Kipling, things are conflicted, things are as subconscious and unconscious as they are conscious. Yes. Forster, on the other hand, is very elegantly, very ironically in control.
But right at the end, the very last sentence, I think, of Passage to India, they're cantering on 2 horses, and the Indian one says, not yet. They want to be brothers, but the Indian one knows they cannot be, and the 2 horses diverge.
Indeed.
That's a very sort of profound insight from, however elegant he was. It was unconscious, it must have been.
Absolutely true. What Forster himself wrote at that point was, in King's College, Cambridge, when he was there early in the century, friendship was everything. And that's what he's putting to test in India. Yeah. Can one be friends while being rulers? And the answer given on the last page is, the Englishman, Fielding, says, yes, let's be friends. And the Indian, Aziz, said, first, I will drive you out into the sea if I do not manage it, whether it takes 5 years or 50 years or 500 years, my children will drive you out into the sea, and then we can be friends.
But I think the very last words are not here, not yet.
Not yet means after 500 years, but it turned out to be only 20 years or 30 years after Foster wrote that novel. Yeah. So it came much sooner, the end of the Raj. To go back to Kipling, Kipling never even thought, never imagined, until the last year of his life, that the British Raj in India would ever end. In the last year, in 1935, after Congress pressure, after the Round Table conferences, British Parliament passed what was called the India Bill. And in 1936, in the last months of his life, Kipling, in his autobiography, is so dejected, he's so heartbroken. He says, this will lead to disaster. It's being passed for totally dishonest reasons by British politicians who don't know better. And he can't begin to contemplate it. It couldn't be interpreted as his deep love for India from childhood on. As children don't want to let go of their favorite things, he doesn't want to let go of India. But India is not a child, or a child's toy, as he finds out.
Yes, absolutely. But I want to go back to him as a writer for a moment, because he spoke to me, and I'm very grateful to your book, because this is my first novel, and I had no idea, I completely forgotten, that there are two characters in my novel. One is a 14-year-old boy who's just been busted for drugs and has been scolded and hates his father, and he identifies with Car. And one is his mother, who lost her mother at the age of 2 and was brought up by her father in India, and he's a wildlife conservationist who specializes in king cobras. So she's ambivalent about India and about wildlife. But can I read a little of it? Because it's exactly the kind of unconscious relating in which you feel that this is your home when it's not your home at all.
And before you do that, when did you first read Kipling?
Oh, my mother read it to me when I was 2. By the age of 3, I knew all the poems. Yeah. I knew, yes. And the samba leaped, and the samba leapt, and the pond in the wood where the wild deer sup. Oh, I mean, God, it was because I think because he was a poet. Because he was a poet and a fiction writer, and he could get at you in both ways. So, wait a minute. It's just... your book is explaining me to myself. Okay, so the mother finds a book under the camp bed her son has been sleeping on, which is an old copy of the Jungle Book, which she's never seen. And the first illustration is a baby playing with wolf cubs and Mother Wolf defending the baby against the tiger. It is I, Shere Khan, who speak. The tiger's roar filled the cave with thunder. Mother Wolf shook herself clear of the cubs and sprang forward, her eyes like 2 green moons in the darkness. I mean, he is so colorful, facing the blazing eyes of Shere Khan. And it is I, Raksha, the demon, who answer. The man's cub is mine, Lungri, mine to me. He shall not be killed. Something rips open in Rosamond as she reads. Through tears, she sees herself reading these words, lying on her bed in India, trying to remember some other scene, a woman's face in England. Shere Khan might have faced Father Wolf, but he could not stand up against Mother Wolf, for he knew that where he was, she had the advantage of the ground and would fight to the death. So he backed out of the cave mouth, growling. This is all she has. Her mother is a memory of a memory. She's been crying these tears all her life. And that is an incredibly powerful passage. And the person who's writing this about Kipling, sort of says, this is the missing Indian mother, or the ayah, or the character that is missing from Rudyard's life.
And this is your first novel? Yes. Obviously, the influence went very deep, which began at the age of 2.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So what would you say to young people who are maybe only know Kipling through the Disney cartoon?
I wondered about that. Kipling has been bundled together with the worst excesses of the Raj in India, also in Britain. The kind of post-colonial guilt that was rampant in the 60s and 70s has subsided a bit. It seems to me that W.H. Auden, perhaps the most radical of all British writers of the 20th century, he said very quickly, time forgives any writer's political views. It has already forgotten Kipling's political views and forgiven. He says, in 1939, only 3 years after Kipling's death, there is politics, and politics passes. We are not under British rule anymore, have not been for a very long time. And therefore, the frame in which we will read Kipling is now quite different from that in which he wrote and from that in which he was first read. What I would say is, let this book be a kind of trigger for people in India, not only young people, but even grown-up people, to revisit Kipling to see what is still profound and attractive in his depiction of India, and what is perhaps still offensive, even after, 75 years it is. I'm speaking tomorrow morning in Delhi at a Sahitya Academy conference, which is celebrating 75 years of Indian independence, which is this year in August. So there is that history, and therefore there is also that distance. Distance from 47, from Kipling's death, and even longer distance from his last Indian writing, a whole century and more. We have a very long perspective on Kipling. Do go out and read Kipling, and do see what, as I said, is still attractive and perhaps still sticks in the throat of Indian readers at least.
When I was preparing for this, I reread Kim, and my God, it's an extraordinary novel. But I was interested also in his portrayal of the Buddhist, because Kim is following this Tibetan guru, the Buddhist, the Muslim, and the Hindu. What's your take on Kim and the different religions of India?
Yeah. No, that's something that many people here wonder about. Buddhism became a big craze in England and Europe for the first time only in the 1880s. There was not much Buddhism in the West before that. And Kipling was growing up. Kipling was a child. He was in school. He read that immensely influential book, a biography of the Buddha, The Light of Asia, by Edwin Arnold. Very sweet-sounding melodic poetry in the late Victorian fashion. And he was very heavily influenced, or at least enchanted by it. At the same time, the Lama comes across to most Indian readers as not spiritual, as not holy, as a bit of a caricature. I write about that in I edited Kim for Penguin Classics, the edition in London, also available here, and I write about this. Kipling would not touch Hinduism, which is a bit of a cop-out, because 80% more people in India are still Hindus. He liked Muslims because of, the old kind of Jewish, Christian, Islamic configuration of what a religion should look like. Also, he said, how can I be really friends with people who would not eat with me? Hindus would not, as we see throughout. So he is displacing the mainstream of India in favor of a very minor figure who is not even Indian but Tibetan. It's a deflection which suits him fine in political terms.
But he does sometimes feel like an Indian guru, a Hindu guru, doesn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. you know, he tried to get the spirituality that exists in Buddhism, unknown to the West, largely, is the same spirituality by and large as at the heart of Hinduism. In fact, it's the West that instituted a very firm distinction between Buddhism and Hinduism as separate religions. Jainism and Hinduism as separate religions. It wasn't so watertight in our own imagination and in our own living practices. So yes, you know, Kipling is doing something very interesting by choosing a Lama, not only a Buddhist, but a Lama who's just come to India from Tibet, who is virtually a foreigner. And the reason, as I have explained in my discussion of Kim, he wants no politics in Kim. There is no Raj, there are no British officials, and the two major characters, one is an Afghan from out of India, one is a Tibetan from out of India. They are not even British subjects. So he is evacuating the novel of direct politics, colonial politics.
But he is giving the most extraordinary image of India's multiplicity. It's the multiplicity above all that you come away from carrying.
Yes, you know, it's a kind of an entanglement in his own mind between, you know, the two sides to one's head that you were talking about. That is right at the heart of how Kipling feels about India, how he writes about India. If it were not that kind of ambivalence, ambiguity, two-sidedness, he would not now be worth reading. Because then he would be far too politically strident and one-sided. But because there were two sides to his head, therefore, at least one side will speak across time and across politics.
And also because he's a poet. because you know, that moment when Mother Wolf stands up to the tiger, you know, her eyes like two green, that green moons. It's just wonderful.
Right.
Okay. So please go and find this book, because there's something in it, the different perspectives of the different authors. Goodness knows how you managed to get them all together. It must have been like herding cats. But they give you so many different angles, don't they? So I think we're over to you now. I'm sure you want to ask him questions. And there will be a roving mic. So can we have the lights up? And
no, I don't know.
Oh, yes, a question over here. Thank you. Hello.
Harish Bhai, hello.
Hare, adab.
Adab. So you know how much I admire your work on Kipling and on many other things, and I've loved this conversation and the point you made about Forster. But where I disagreed with you was in the point that you made that Kim was not political. You know, I mean, where do we get the deepest insight into the great game from that novel? And, you know, I mean, it's about deep politics. And, you know, a game which continues from the 19th century, you know, over to the 20th, hasn't ended even now.
No, that's a valid point. And let's also mention another book on Kipling written in India, no? Will you care to do that? Yeah, right.
Question over there. Oh.
Someone here? Yeah.
Hello? It's hard for me to see, so I'm...
You have a mic here? Yeah, right, okay.
Hi. Can you elaborate more on Kipling's Shimla summers, the years he spent while he was working for the Civil Military Gazette and the summers that he spent in Shimla? How that shaped, you know, his perspective towards the British in India? Because he wrote a lot about the scandals and, you know, how it was a merrymaking, how that period was full of fun and frolic for the British in the...
I'm sorry, could you speak up a bit and rephrase that briefly?
Yeah, so I want to know about his stay in Shimla, the summers that he spent in Shimla. How did it shaped his writings?
How did he get, sorry,
How did it shape his writings?
How did it shape his writings, when particularly staying in Shimla, and yes, particularly you're thinking of the sort of the portrayal of the British and the tales from the Raj and so on. How did that shape his writing?
Yeah, you know, about his locations, Kipling's locations, and the influence of those locations on him. There's Bombay when he's very young. Shimla, he caricatured most of the time. Because the British, while pretending to rule India from a cooler place, Shimla, were in fact escaping India. Not only the heat of the plains, but also the responsibilities. It was lots of flirtation. It was lots of liaisons, the way Kipling describes it. Maybe he exaggerates. The business of the government did get done. It's not as if... He also shows how corrupt some of the higher officials are, because they can be influenced by an attractive woman in making very important decisions. So that's white folly, is what I've called it in my description of that period. It's not as if, Lahore and Shimla, he was most of the time in Lahore, only for some months in Shimla. And then, of course, he goes to Allahabad. He's posted to Allahabad for 1.5 years at the end. So that Shimla connection stops. Allahabad is the test for him. Is Hindu, unlike Lahore, is not half Muslim. And he is sent out to Rajasthan. I must mention this. He has a book on Rajasthan. He has a book of travels in Rajasthan. And it's not a separate book. It's part of his travel letters. The Pioneer, the newspaper from Allahabad that he was working on, sent him as a roving reporter to many places. And for a month he was here. And what he wrote has historical interest. It should not be used as a guidebook now. But, it has a layer, really, of sensibility. Rajasthan was the only place, because they were princely states. It was not part of British India, where he was not treated as a sahib, where he suddenly realized that the British are not ruling here directly. It's a big shock to him. He went to Chittor, and he was totally freaked out by Gomukh, where water is coming down a slippery slope. The Johar or Padmini, all that he reads about, he's known nothing like that in British India. So there are many Indias, and in Allahabad, he begins to experience that. Many locations in India. Not South India, but the rest of it, yes, quite a bit.
But the characters, often in the short stories, he's very satirical about the British. Isn't he?
That's right. He loved children. He loved his own childhood. He loved children. In one of the stories, there's a child called Todd. And what does he do? Because he can speak to his servants, and they speak openly to him, Todd tells a member of the executive council of the Viceroy that the decision that they are taking about tenancy rights in agriculture is not going to be helpful to the peasants. How does Todd know this and not the executive councillor? Because the executive councillor does not know the language and cannot speak on the level with the servants. Yeah.
We have about 3 more minutes. Is there one more question? Yes. Have I missed somebody who asked at the back? Please, at the back.
She's got it, I think.
But Harish will be signing copies of the book, and I'm sure if you want to ask him questions, you can.
Anybody who wants to see how I write Kipling, because I'll sign in behalf of Kipling.
So, have we got a question at the back there?
Yeah. So, sir, you said that Kipling said India was terrible and India was horrible.
No, I said that Kipling thought India was terrible.
Yeah.
I think you thought he felt it was terrible.
Yeah,
and you gave an etymological justification that, he thought that India evoked terror and India evoked horror.
Oh, you were listening very carefully.
But there's a difference between terror and terrifying and horror and horrifying.
Yeah.
So do you think that sort of interpretation by him was coming from the same sentiment with which he wrote, The White Man's Burden?
Yeah, it's very difficult to describe what is happening in the subconscious or even the unconscious of a writer, of a creative writer, which finds expression in a variety of ways. From time to time, for example, he has many images. He says, Kipling says, there is a very narrow strip on which the British walk in India without looking left, without looking right, and below is a deep abyss, which they know nothing about. There is another short story in which a British person posted in India goes out riding in the morning just for exercise, and he falls into a pit. And as he falls into a pit, he falls deeper and deeper and deeper, and there is almost no bottom to it. And he never comes out of it until a servant comes along looking for him. Now, these are the kind of images of terror and horror, as I described, that keep coming up. They're not, they're, if you like, they're very ordinary stories as well of mundane reality, everyday reality, but there are flashes of how India is beyond the knowable limits of most Britishers.
Wonderful. Have you got a very quick question? Because I'm going to get into trouble. Oh, I'm so sorry. The light's completely dazzling me. Yes,
Sorry.
please.
Sorry, quick question. Sir, hello, sir. So, Orwell writes about Kipling, and he says that Kipling is a shameful pleasure. It's a taste for cheap sweets that some people carry into middle age. And when I've read Kipling, and as a child enjoyed it, obviously, but when I reread Kipling as a teenager or in college, and I read Ganga Din, and I read White Man's Burden, this keeps coming back to me as though I enjoy it very much, but it's almost like you can enjoy Kipling only when you know what is so obviously wrong with him. And is that something that you feel as well at the end of your, shall we say, study into Kipling?
Yeah. It's a very nice description of how one should go on reading Kipling over and over again, and each time find something different. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
We have to stop here. I'm already in trouble silently from signals from running out. But please come and talk to him and ask your questions, because I feel sorry and I can't see. But anyway, you've been a wonderful audience. And please thank Harish.
Thank you, Harish Trivedi and Ruth Padel. There is a book signing area towards the right. If you want to get your book signed, the speaker will be there to sign them.